During the most recent Maryland legislative session, a number of bills were introduced, debated, and eventually decided upon. But which of these bills have become laws that could impact your small business? We'll address some of the highlights as well as other updates from the session on today's show. Welcome to CSuite on Your Street, a show where we talk about what you need to know to start, run, and grow your small business. I'm LaTaunya Howard, your host and fellow small business owner of Howard Corporate Center right here in the city of Laurel. On this program, we speak with entrepreneurs and experts on a wide range of business topics. Our goal, to share resources, tips, and tricks to help you operate and think like a CEO, wherever you are on your entrepreneurial journey. We have a returning guest today, Mr. Davion Percy, a senior government relations consultant with the law firm of Alexander and Cleaver, PA. Mr. Percy first appeared on the show in December 2018 to share insights on how small business owners can use their voice to help shape public policy. Today, Mr. Percy will provide some highlights of key legislation coming out of the recent Maryland legislative session impacting small business owners. Mr. Percy, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, LaTaunya. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So it's been an exciting few months since the last time you were here. A very interesting legislative session that just adjourned last month, and even some history was made, which we'll talk about. So let's get right into it and talk about some of the key legislation coming out of this year's session that impacts small business owners particularly. One that was probably the highlight, if there was one, of the session was the Fight for 15 legislation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the legislature has been taking up this Fight for 15 bill for a few years now. This year, we finally saw it go across the finish line, which means the bill got passed. It raises the minimum wage in the state of Maryland to $15 an hour across the entire state by 2025 for most businesses, and by 2026 for small businesses, which are defined as businesses that have fewer than 15 employees. Okay.
And like you said, this was not the first time that this legislation has been introduced, because I imagine there was some pushback from, certain small businesses or maybe even larger businesses. And your company really helps to be a voice, or help small business owners to share their voice and their concern about legislation. So can you give us some insights on the types of issues that came up during the debates and what ultimately allowed the law to pass this year as opposed to past years?
Yeah, there were several businesses on both sides of the issue. Maryland is considered American miniature. We believe that when you come to Maryland, because of our diverse economy, our diverse geography, and our demographics, that this is a microcosm of America. So one of the challenges that we had was that in the urban counties, in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and in Baltimore City, and a few others, there was a big push to raise the minimum wage. But when you look out in Western Maryland, Hagerstown, Cumberland, those areas that border Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and you look across to the Eastern Shore, there was major opposition. So we represent several businesses that had an interest in this. They were largely opposed to the issue. But one of the things that we did was we helped to guide our businesses through how to advocate on that issue. Number one, what we do is what we call take the temperature, of this issue. So we look at what's happening and how this is developing and determine the likelihood of whether or not this bill will pass. And because we knew that this bill was likely to pass, we didn't go in opposing the bill. We decided to advise our clients to take a position of support with amendments so that we can negotiate something that's a little better for businesses.
Okay, very good, very good. So another piece of legislation that came out, and you told us about this, you were expecting this when you were on set back in December, you were expecting this to come up, was the federal 8A procurement bill. So you gave us some insights back in December, but let us know how this legislation actually came to fruition this go round.
So this bill was brought up in the 2018 session as well. It almost got to the finish line, but didn't pass. So the sponsors brought it back in the 2019 session. And essentially what that bill does is it says that if you are a small business and you are have been admitted through the Small Business Administration's Section 8A program, and you're located in Maryland, you like to do business in Maryland, that you can receive some sort of reciprocity to Maryland. So prior to this legislation, you would have to go through a process that is just as extensive on a state level, or if not more extensive, than what's required on the federal level, and it frustrated a lot of business owners. So what this does is once this bill goes into effect, which I believe in October, you will be able to present your certifying documents that you received, admitting you to the federal Section 8A program, and receive expedited processing here on a state level.
Okay, so that I know that's going to save a lot of businesses a lot of time, because that is a very intensive process. I know.
Right, especially for businesses that are, really looking at diversifying their portfolio. What we've seen in our clients that do federal business, because of the uncertainty on the federal government level right now, on Capitol Hill and in the White House, they're looking to diversify and do more business at the state level, but they felt that the process was prohibitive. So this makes it much easier for those small businesses to diversify and do business on the state level.
Okay, so let me back up a little bit, back to the Fight for 15, and I guess to some extent this applies to the 8.8 as well. If I'm not mistaken, part of what your company does is some business consulting or business development in a sense. So now that we know that these two laws are in effect, the 8A, the federal 8A reciprocity, which is probably most likely seen as a positive thing, and the Fight for 15, which may not entirely be seen as positive.
Right.
How are you preparing your companies, who are your clients, to prepare for these changes, which could be substantial, at least for the Fight for 15 in particular?
So there are a few things that we're doing. Number one is we're ramping up our advocacy for our companies that are seeking to do business with the government. One of the concerns that came up during a Fight for 15 discussion was for those businesses that primarily do business with state government and governments, our municipal and county governments throughout the state. Their concern was being paid on time. There's a long process for understandable reasons that the government has to go through just to pay a vendor. And all too often we found that process goes beyond the predicted process, so it gets delayed. So we had businesses that we represented that actually testified, and one of our business owners, one of my clients said, I want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I love to pay my employees $15 an hour, but the challenge is you all don't pay on time. So I've got to take out a loan to cover my bottom line until I get paid, 6 months from now. And then by that time, I'm covering this loan and its interest, and it's affected my cash flow. So we're prepared, and we've done it before, to advocate on behalf of our businesses to make sure that those invoices are taken care of on time, to help position those businesses that would like to do business with the government, to make sure that their paperwork is in order, that all of their bases are covered, that all the requirements are met. And then we do things like look at the procurement forecast, what's coming down the pike, that we can get our businesses prepared for early, so that we can expand their portfolio.
Okay, excellent. And another piece of legislation that passed this year, which is another piece of history that Maryland made, was the styrofoam ban. Maryland was actually the first state to actually pass this statewide. Tell us about that. So
the styrofoam ban bans the use of styrofoam for food purposes, so restaurants, grocery stores, takeout, coffee cups, all of those types of things. And how this came to fruition, it was sponsored by Delegate Brooke Learman. This bill was sponsored in part because counties were banning styrofoam in their local jurisdiction. Prince George's County banned it, and there were a few others that banned it. So instead of having 23 counties, in Baltimore City, where in one county styrofoam is banned here, in another county it's not, the legislature decided to ban it statewide. And the intent behind the movement overall is to protect the environment here. Maryland is big on protecting our Chesapeake Bay, our oysters, our crabs, and our overall environment. So that was the intent behind this bill.
Okay. And one other piece of legislation that we'll talk about, you mentioned this when you came on set right before the session, was the predictive restrictive scheduling. You were expecting that, and I guess a number of other people were expecting that to have some movement in the legislature this year, but it didn't. So tell us a little about that.
Yeah, so we were expecting that there was a slim possibility that it would be introduced in a 2019 session. There have been discussions about it for several sessions prior, and we're still hearing discussions about it. And also, as the legislature leans more left, become more progressive, we expect to see that. And essentially, what that bill does is it requires advanced scheduling. We've seen models from 2 weeks to more. Advanced scheduling, and that's the predictive part.
Right.
The restrictive part is it limits and adds penalties for changing a person's schedule. This mostly affects food service workers, hourly employees that work shifts. Understanding the intent behind the bill, one of the challenges that it poses is for those industries where you cannot always predict what your scheduling needs may be. One example I gave on the last episode that I was on was, sometimes, you expect a Tuesday and a Wednesday at a restaurant to be slow, but maybe there's a graduation that day or a big concert in the city, and you get an influx of people and you need to call folks in. There are days where you expect a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday to be pretty busy, but for whatever reason, it's not, and you need to scale down. So those are things that we're looking for. Our businesses are paying close attention to that. We're listening to chatter. I expect that there's an increased possibility. They've dealt with so many big issues from, minimum wage, and others that, restrictive and predictive scheduling probably just didn't have the room to be another major issue on the legislative agenda this year. But we do expect within the next couple of years that will become a top issue.
Okay, good. And that's a good segue into looking a little bit into the future for the 2020 session. A little bit later on, we'll talk about ways that the viewers can research some of the other legislation that came up. But just kind of fast forwarding, I guess, about 9 months from now to the beginning of the next session, you anticipate maybe the predictive restrictive bill coming up again, possibly?
So we any session now, we anticipate that bill coming up, and we also, just to bounce back just a little bit, we anticipate that the $15 minimum wage discussion will come back. There's some things that weren't in the bill that our clients and other folks in other jurisdictions think could fix the bill, and we also. And there are a few other bills that we anticipate coming soon, but those are the two that I'm mostly looking at.
Right. And another one that we talked about offline perhaps is an internet sales tax and online sports betting as a way to generate additional tax revenue potentially. Yes. Okay.
So we were looking out for that last year as well. In addition to the businesses that we represent several smaller governments that are looking to increase their tax base. So we were looking out for that. We expect sports betting to come very soon, maybe next session. I think that's highly likely in my opinion, and that internet sales tax discussion.
Okay. And then another interesting piece of legislation that I wasn't even considering was what was called a drug take-back program. Tell us a little bit about that and what the future possibility of that being discussed again might be.
Well, one of the priorities that we've seen in the legislature is addressing the opioid issue, the opioid misuse and abuse epidemic that we're seeing all across the country, and especially here in the state of Maryland. There was a drug take-back bill that was introduced during the last legislative session. It didn't get any traction. The intent is to give people more options for disposing of their medications so that they won't be abused. The challenge that we have there that we had last year was who pays for it. Right. So in addition to the discussion about price gouging and overall discussions on prescription medication, we're looking at how do we address the opioid issue without passing on the cost to the consumer, but also, without limiting the profit margins of those drug companies, especially the over-the-counter drug companies. The previous bill that was introduced included both prescription and non-prescription drugs. There's no opioids in non-prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, but it included that as well, and it required the companies to pay for them themselves and reimburse the state for administering the program. Okay. So those were some challenges that we saw. The sponsors of the bill seemed very open to having a discussion about it and leading up to next session. So we expect that to come back. And we expect that to be a very vibrant discussion. Why is that important? Is because we found through the clients that I represent that there are several small independently owned pharmacies throughout the state of Maryland. So, when we think about pharmacies, we think about the CVS's and the Rite Aids of the world, but there's several mom and pop pharmacies that are owned by a family, has been in a family for years, and adjusting to this type of thing could be a challenge for them. So if you have anyone in your audience who owns a pharmacy, they should certainly look out for that because it's coming back.
Okay, very good, very good. So what I want to do now is just shift gears just a little bit. We talked about at least one piece of legislation that created history for the state of Maryland, the styrofoam ban, Maryland being the first state to implement that statewide. Another type of history was made this year too with the election of a new speaker, which was due to the unfortunate passing of former Speaker Mike Bush. I know your firm was impacted by that because of relationships that you've had with the speaker and other legislators as well. So tell us, just a little bit about that transition and, what you expect that means for the future of Maryland. Yeah,
just one point. Not only did we have a relationship with the late Mike Bush, who was the speaker for about 16 years or so, but the office of the speaker itself has a special place at Alexander and Cleaver. Gary Alexander, one of the founders of the firm, was the Speaker Pro Tem when he was there, when he served in the legislature, and Casper Taylor, one of our senior advisors, was the speaker. Mike Bush took the office of speaker when Cass left office. We made history. There were two to three people, depending on what point in the race you were watching, that was running. One was Maggie McIntosh. She would have been the first woman to serve as speaker, the first openly gay speaker in the history of the state. The other was Derek Davis, who would have been the first African American to serve as speaker, and the other was a Speaker Pro Tem, Adrian Jones, who served as a Speaker Pro Tem under Mike Bush during his entire time as speaker. It was a very tumultuous battle campaign there, and it was very interesting. Adrian Jones pulled out of the race and put her support behind Derek Davis, and the party couldn't come to a compromise on who they wanted, so they ended up putting Adrian Jones' name back in the race. So now, and for the first time in the history of the state of Maryland, we have Adrian Jones, who is the Speaker of the House. That's important because she's the first woman and the first African American. So originally we had a choice between a woman and an African American, and by electing Adrian Jones, we got the best of both worlds. Right.
I heard, I wasn't there, of course, but I heard it was very theatrical the way everything happened.
Yes, it was.
So one of the things that we like to do before we close out every show is to give our viewers action items that they can implement today, put use to, and put all of this into context. So one of the action items that we talked about was to review the 90-day report of the legislative session. This is something that is available on the MGA website, and it not only goes into more detail of some of the legislation that you highlighted, but perhaps other types of laws as well, right?
Yeah, so that's very important. Of course, we couldn't cover all 2,400 pieces of legislation that was introduced this year.
Okay.
So reviewing the 90-day report would be beneficial for businesses. There was legislation passed related to occupational licensing, related to background checks for certain people who work in certain industries, labor practices, and others. So it's very important. You can go into the Department of Legislative Services website and click on the 90-day report and get a good comprehensive review of all of the legislation that was passed.
Very good. And we've also provided a link to that publication on the screen. We also suggest that viewers just go to the Maryland General Assembly website and just familiarize themselves with their legislators and just other types of activities that are going on during the interim in between sessions as well.
Yes. So there's an interim calendar that's uploaded on the website where you can look at different dates. There's several activities that are going on throughout the state where you can meet your legislators. And the website itself is very resourceful.
Okay.
I mean, as lobbyists, that's our Bible. We follow that website. It's very important to go on there and you can delve into more detail about the legislation that was passed, get background on legislators, find out who your legislator is, who your delegate or your senator is that represents your business or your home, and reach out to them.
Okay. And then kind of related to the second one is just to stay involved. So not only reach out to your legislators, but a lot of work happens during the interim. You know, your firm is busy during the interim and, don't necessarily just wait until the session begins to do your homework.
Exactly. So the interim period is the 9-month period from the time that the one legislative session ends to the time that the next legislative session begins. So the next legislative session begins in early January. So right now we're in an interim period. Most firms or most companies that have an active presence in Annapolis are usually working out all of the details during the interim. One of the first things we do is we meet with our clients and we look at where we were successful and where we need to improve, and we immediately start putting in a plan, executing that plan to do so, from meeting with legislators to galvanizing the community or whatever we have to do. So this is the perfect time to build a relationship with your elected official, ask questions about legislation, and work with firms like mine or other consulting firms to help put together a legislative plan so that your company, your small business can ensure that its voice is heard in Annapolis come January. Absolutely.
Very good. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, so my final thought would be, in addition to all of those things, we had a historic legislative session. It's the most diverse legislative session, most diverse legislature we've had in the history. More women, a mix of races, mix of ages, mix of ideas. So we're going to see, a lot of new legislation come out that we haven't seen before. And with the new speaker, we're going to see more people feel, more free to try new things, right? Our committee chairs are going to be feel more empowered to move legislation forward. And also, this was the first session of the new term. So we had about a 30+% turnover. So you have all of those elected officials during the last session that were just trying to, figure out where the bathrooms are, and not cause too much trouble. Well, they're familiar now. So they're going to be introducing legislation. So it's very important that that everyone gets engaged. We are facing a tough budget year coming up. It's been predicted that the state will go through a recession as a result of many factors. So they're going to be looking for more sources of revenue. So it's important that that as a business owner you pay attention to that, because there are times where the revenue generator is placed on the backs of the residential taxpayers, and then there are times when it's placed on the backs of the businesses. And you want to make sure that your businesses, your best interests are represented in Annapolis.
Very good. Thank you so much for your advice. This has been extremely helpful.
Certainly.
And thank you for tuning in to C-Suite on Your Street. Please tune in again next time to learn more about how to start, run, and grow your small business. And be sure to connect with us on Facebook at C-Suite on Your Street. Until then, I'd like to share our quote of the month. It always seems impossible until it's done. Take care.